Hey guys, we're going to talk about Freud's psychosexual stages, just to kind of reiterate a little bit of what we talked about in class today. I know this is not the best format for a lecture, but I am literally working with what I have here. So we're just going to kind of go through each of these individual stages so that everyone is on the same page. Now, when we talk about Freud's psychosexual stages, remember that Freud believed that we progress through 5 different psychosexual stages of development and believed that the foundation of our adult personality was established within the first 5 years of life. And this really incorporates the oral, anal, and phallic psychosexual stages. And so when we look at the first stage of looking at, for example, the oral stage, each one of these stages requires that a child, basically successfully resolves some developmental conflict. And so if a child is frustrated, they might be left with feelings of unmet needs that are characteristic of the stage. And if a child is overindulged in this stage, what we might find is that a child may be reluctant to move on to the next stage. And so if there is a case of unresolved developmental conflict, we call this essentially a fixation. So a child may actually become fixated in a particular stage, which can affect their personality as an adult. And so if we look at, for example, the first stage, which is the oral stage, this is up to the first year of life. We find that children focus primarily on oral pleasure. So they like to, put things in their mouth. They will feed. They will, use pacifiers. They'll suck on anything that you put near their mouth. And they're feeding through nipple, whether it's a bottle or a person. And so what ends up happening is if a person does not, if a person becomes fixated at the oral stage, whether it's due to frustration, maybe they have a tongue tie and they're not able to feed properly, or if, for example, they are overindulged, they're given a pacifier, for a really long time. When a child becomes fixated in the oral stage, we might see as an adult, they might bite their nails, they might have an unnatural or an abnormal fixation on putting things in their mouths. They might like to chew on pencils, things like that. Or even you find in adulthood sucking their thumbs or something like that. Now, when we look at progressing through, once the child is able to progress through the oral stage, what ends up happening is then they move on to the anal stage, which is about 1 to 3 years old. And this particular stage is in essence made up of potty training. And so what the child does is gets pleasure out of voiding their bowels and being in control of this. And so if a child really is frustrated or overindulged in this anal stage, what we might find is this will translate into adulthood as what we call anal retentive. So this is a person that's extremely inflexible and rigid. They do not like to, have anything to they like to have control. And if there's anything that a person can't control or is out of their control, they can't they can't control. They become inflexible, and they don't want to they for example, if a person is told that they can't do a certain thing, they might get very, very angry, very frustrated, or they want to do it their way. And so we may refer to that as being anal retentive. If the child is able to progress through the anal stage and meet those milestones properly, then they'll enter the phallic stage. Now this phallic stage is about ages 3 to 6 years old, and that's where the genitals become a primary focus of their pleasurable sensations. You might actually find children start to be very curious about their genitals. They may even masturbate or attempt to masturbate. And this is around the age of 6 is where we find sexual orientation becoming established. They may not, say, actually look like they are, talking about sexual attraction to somebody. It might be sort of, I like them, or something like that at a very young age. But we do find evidence that sexual orientation is established very early on in life. Now, the phallic stage, this is one of those ones that I talked about where it gets kind of funky. Freud was one of those, he was a psychoanalyst who was very, very obsessed with sex. And so we find that he talks a lot about sex. And if we look at the Oedipus Complex, which occurs during the phallic stage, this is the milestone that a child must essentially resolve. And so in the phallic stage, this Oedipus complex is a critical conflict, and it's one that the child must successfully resolve in order to have a healthy personality and sexual development as an adult. Now, the Oedipus complex is named so because of the story of Oedipus, which is a Greek story where a man and his wife had a child named Oedipus, and they wanted to ask the oracle what the future held for their child. And the oracle said, oh, well, your child is going to marry his mother and kill his father. And so they freaked out and said, oh, well, we can't have that. So they cast him out. I believe they tried to kill him, but he ended up not dying. And he grew up not knowing who his family was, not realizing who his family was. And he came into the town where his mother and father lived and decided to marry the woman and kill her husband, which ended up being, spoiler alert, his mother and father. And so, his fate ended up being exactly as it was predicted. And this Oedipus complex is named after this idea that a child has an unconscious sexual desire for an opposite sex parent, and then they are hostile toward the same sex parent. So in essence, what we find is that a boy will sexually desire his mother, and so he feels conflicted and experiences hostility and jealousy towards his father, and may confront the father with this hostility. Now, at some point, the boy will realize that his father is more powerful physically than he is, and experience fear that the father will actually castrate him, knowing if he knew his secret desires. And so in order to resolve this conflict, a boy will identify with his father. He'll imitate and internalize the father's values, his attitudes and mannerisms, in essence, resolving this conflict and being able to identify with the father, kind of like this, if you can't beat him, you join him sort of thing. Now, with girls, Freud is very well admitted that he does not understand the sexual life of adult women. And so he very, very well known for not being very good at understanding women in their sex lives. But in essence, he believed that girls go through something similar where they sexually desire their fathers, and are angry at their mothers, not only hostile to them because they want to be with their father, but also because they realize that they do not have a penis. And this is, the age where girls are starting to realize, and boys are starting to realize, that there are differences physically between boys and girls. And the girl realizes, oh, I don't have a penis. My mother has not prepared me for this world. And then develops what's referred to as penis envy, which is a deprivation and loss that's experienced when realizing you don't have a penis. And so in order to resolve this, of course, that a girl has to then identify with her mother, much like a boy identifies with her father and realizes, okay, I can't beat her, so I might as well join her. And this is one of Freud's most highly criticized areas, as the idea of penis envy and the Oedipus complex. These are very, very highly criticized of Freud. But if we're able to resolve this, what ends up happening is you go back into, you leave the phallic stage and enter the latency phase. And this is because the Oedipus complex causes great anxiety. And so the sexual urges of boys and girls become repressed and in essence go through what we refer to as a latent period. And this is the ages 7 to 11. And so a child will desire to associate with their same-sex peers, which is a preference that strengthens the child's sexual identity. They become, focused on, relationships with same-sex friends. For example, a little girl will, have other little girl friends, and boys will, relate to other little boys of the same age. They focus on things like school and sports and other important activities that they're doing at the time. And then once they leave this latency period, this is really triggered by, by puberty, by adolescence. So starting at about age 12, children enter what's called the genital phase, the genital stage, and this is in essence, the final resolution of the Oedipus complex in adolescence. And so those urges, those sexual urges, start to resurface. But these urges for the opposite sex parents are prohibited by the superego as well as societal restriction, and the person can then redirect these sexual urges toward something that's socially acceptable, which is often a friend or a peer, and a lot of times we find that peer will actually resemble the person's opposite sex parent. And then what ends up happening is, of course, you end up marrying someone that looks a lot like your parent. And so, this is the age where physical and sexual maturity is reached. The genitals become this primary focus of pleasurable sensation, very much like we saw during the phallic stage. But then, they do this in a mature and in a relatively adult fashion. So this is kind of like just a rundown of the stages. And I'm going to kind of split this video up so that way you guys can get these pieces at a time. But I think that that's a really good sort of breakdown of the stages and a little bit of a review of we started to cover in class. So if you have any questions about these individual stages, please, let me know during class or go ahead and email me. But as long as you look at this table and kind of realize some of these sort of side notes that I've made here, then you should be good in terms of the quiz.